Today we're going to talk about Dubai and a very interesting paper, Dubai's role in facilitating corruption and global illicit flows, published by Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I have the pleasure to have with me today Jodi Vittori. Jodi is a resident fellow with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and US Research and Policy Manager for Transparency International's Defense and Security Program. And Jodi is an expert of the linkages of corruption, state fragility, illicit finance, and US national security. Thank you, Jodi, for being with us. And then Lakshmi Kumar. Welcome, Lakshmi. You are the policy director at Global Financial Integrity. Lakshmi works on issues of illicit finance and trade and institutions that facilitate movement of illicit money across borders. And finally, we had Matthew Page, who is a resident scholar with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and an associate fellow with the Africa program at Chatham House. Until recently, if I'm not wrong, you were the US intelligence community's top Nigeria expert at the Department of State's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. Welcome here. Dubai is a city full of contradiction. On one side, it's a Sharia law city, and on the other side, it's a home to many traffickers, criminals, mobsters, terrorists. So it's a city built on contradiction. Let's start with Jodi. Jodi, Dubai is really a true facilitator of corruption, and why?
Dubai is really a unique place, and we found it fascinating as we put together this multidisciplinary team to understand what was going on in Dubai, because it is such a complex location, as you noted, for a couple reasons. One is that it's grown so quickly into a key area of illicit financial flows. When you look at other major areas, Frankfurt, London, New York, these are places that have been huge financial flows, banking, trade centers for often hundreds of years. When you really look at Dubai, only in the 90s does it start becoming a significant banking sector. Early 2000s, it becomes a significant real estate location. It all happened so quickly. Even by 1998, however, even with that very recent time period of becoming, free trade zone and a trade port and so on, it's already become a problem for illicit financial flows, with the United States citing them for concerns about terrorism finance, for example. It's also interesting because it doesn't have any of the advantages we would think of in a major place for trade, illicit or illicit, banking, real estate, and so forth as well. It is not a natural port. It requires a tremendous amount of dredging, for example, to keep the Jebel Ali port open. It's not a natural place where you would tend to find things like a New York City or a London or something like that. There's no fresh water there. There's no, like Singapore has. It was not a major airport or anything until really the Emir of Dubai decided he wanted an airline, and the airports and the facilities that went with it decided to put a lot of money into it and just create that. But it wasn't a natural location for air travel, for example, like you might find in the United States. And yet somehow in a very short period of time, it created a place that is not only a pass-through for illicit financial flows and illicit trade, as well as the legal type, but it's also a destination. To give an example, when Isabel dos Santos of Angola found that she was losing her job as the head of the Angolan state oil company, Sonangol, that day, she needed to find a way to empty the European bank accounts in a very short matter of time. And as the Brookings Institution pointed out last week, as well as the the New York Times and other sites, within a matter of hours, she and her financial advisors had emptied the European accounts of the state oil company and moved those assets through a series of consultancy contracts and so forth to Dubai. So what is it about the kind of place that when you need to empty an entire company's bank accounts for a certain geographic location, what makes it that you send that money to Dubai? And what makes it possible that Dubai is the place that you can send that sort of money to? And that was really the types of puzzles that we were trying to understand. I had worked on Afghanistan issues, and we had seen massive amounts of flows that were well documented going through Dubai. I worked with Latin Americanists who were seeing the same problems. working with those like Matthew in Africa, seeing the same sort of problems. And this is why we decided to focus on Dubai. Not because there aren't other important illicit financial flows locations, including in the United States and UK and so forth, but because we kept coming up on it so often. And despite incredible work by investigative journalists over the years, there wasn't really one place where one could go to really understand the issues of regulatory capture and investment and trade-based money laundering stuff in one spot.
Why real estate is so crucial to understand the money laundering activities in Dubai? I mean, we have real estate issues in Miami, in many, because the big issue is the lack of a legal framework. I know that FinCEN is trying to do some targeting, geographic targeting orders, but they are very shortly measures in a problem that is huge. But why Dubai, in your opinion, is more dangerous than other countries in terms of real estate?
So anywhere that you're going to do large-scale money laundering, you know, in the tens, hundreds of millions of dollars, even billions of dollars at times, it's incredibly helpful to have a very large real estate market that you can put a lot of money into, because it's just very hard to do the kind of contracts and other money laundering, bulk cash and so forth, that you need to move that money in an efficient manner of time. Buying, you know, multi-million-dollar real estate and the ability to flip it is incredibly helpful. And that's the kinds of things you see in the other money laundering locations you brought up, Miami, New York, London, et cetera, that are well documented. And so Dubai really created that capability. They enabled foreigners to buy property in Dubai. And as Peter Kirichou of C4ADS noted, when they went through and got a 2016 registry of properties, it was relatively easy for anybody to buy a property there. One of the things that struck everyone looking through those registries is not only that they're the number of people on it, but how openly they were living. Oftentimes they weren't going by code names or switching out names or doing the really typical difficult things that one would do, or using necessarily anonymous shell companies, or all those sorts of things that are particularly prominent in Miami or London or the United States. It's not that anonymous shell companies weren't used, of course, but it was, as Leaked Property History noted, it was relatively easy for people just to buy property, no questions asked, and live there openly. You know, kids go to school, parents go to the PTA meetings, all that in just a way you really can't do in a London or the United Kingdom and so forth.
And they were able to create a criminal environment where to establish people, to settle people.
It seems the rules are that so long as you keep your activities quiet and below the radar, there did not seem to be a great deal of willingness by the authorities to go after many of these people aggressively, unless the international community really made them a tremendous priority. And it was interesting, one of the things that struck us was the dichotomy. Reuters had done a big investigation on the surveillance system, for example, in Dubai. And analysts from the United States who had worked on it had noted that, you know, the Emirates is very quick to monitor everything that goes on in the country. Exactly. A 16-year-old who puts out a mildly critical tweet about the Emirati royal family will quickly find a knock at their door. But if you're Isabel dos Santos, who has seemingly moved to Dubai, there doesn't seem to be that same knock at the door for some reason. So it's not a lack of capacity of the police force.
Exactly.
Although we've noted, and our excellent author, Karen Greenway, noted some weaknesses that could be filled in. It's a lack of willingness, it seems, for all but a certain number of situations to really enforce those laws.
Just to conclude with you, we have other illicit flows, gold smuggling, weapons smuggling. I mean, a lot of criminal activities. Do you think that is a lost battle? Because actually you have many critical international players, from Russia to China, Iran. I mean, a lot of criminal activities. I mean, it's really hard from the Western countries, from the democracies to monitor, to try to control these crucial hotspot for organized crime, don't you think?
I think in the case of Dubai, and the reason we started this project initially was because so much seemed to transfer there. It stood out so much. when working in Afghanistan, the amount of bulk cash that was flying out on Afghan airlines into Dubai on a daily basis, pallets of cash, are hard to miss.
Yes, I live in South America, so I perfectly know what you're talking about. Yeah.
If I don't want to step into the work that Matthew is going to be talking about on policy prescriptions, but there's a lot of areas where outside countries who have a lot of influence can, I think, get policy change in Dubai. We've seen that when, for example, the United States after 9/11 was very interested in certain terrorist finance issues. They cracked down a great deal on them, and Dubai and the UAE overall was at least willing to provide some compliance. The same thing goes with concerns about Iran sanctions, with Dubai at least being willing to audit their Iranian institutions operating within Dubai. And as we note in the report, Dubai has a very, very tight, long history of legitimate and illicit trade with Iran. So that's a very big deal from them from a political economy perspective. There is the possibility for change there. In the long term, it will probably require some level of a willingness of a monarchy to move from an absolute monarchy to a more constitutional monarchy, which would allow things like the independent oversight and accountability and decrease the regulatory capture that exists there now.
Thank you so much, Jodi.
Thank you.
Let's talk about the ruling family. The ruling family playing a very important role in Dubai. We have a 30 free trade zone, and sometimes we have a feeling that the ruling family control at the same time should be controlled, because they really have, for example, the Emirates Postal Service and Al Maktoum Exchange Bureau were part of money laundering schemes, and the ruling family was involved in it. So from your perspective, what is the situation and how the free trade zones are really represents a problem for the country?
Thank you so much, Maria. And you raised an interesting question when you said, it's not that I think we feel like the ruling family controls Dubai. They in fact do control Dubai. And I think that was sort of well exemplified at different places in the report. But I want to sort of, draw your attention to the chart that we included in the report, which really maps the shareholding of the family within different institutions. If you have complete autonomy to sort of pick who runs your regulatory and supervisory institutions, that is, concrete evidence of how far and how deeply entrenched your control is. And I think the juxtaposition of that is that when you think of an institution, especially a regulatory institution that is controlled and where there is no supervision over control, which then the question then becomes, where do the loyalties of that institution lie? Do their loyalties lie to their job as a regulator, or do their loyalties lie to the person that is putting them in power? And I don't think it's a very complicated argument to make that your loyalties then lie to the person that's giving you the job, because the moment you run afoul of that person or the family that provides you that job, then you cease to have that job. So I think it's clearly sort of benchmarked at a very high level, sort of which side your bread is buttered on. If you sort of drill down further and you start looking at how the individual free zone authorities themselves are set up, and you look sort of, if you look at their websites and you look at what they promise, what they are promising you is a speedier, efficient way to set up your company. There are no talks about wanting to do checks and balances. There is no conversation or there is nothing stated within their websites or anything they put out where the sense you get that their priorities, their foremost priorities are actually to make sure that they are not used as a conduit, source, or destination for sort of illicit money. The primary focus is on making it as easy as possible to set up a company, make money, repatriate that money from Dubai back to your sort of home destination without the encumbrances of tax, customs, or any other laws, which is why all free zones have distinct and separate labor law, commercial laws, employment laws, distinct from the mainland of UAE. And if you look at any free zone authority website, the goal, as I think we described them, as I described in the paper, is the goal of trade facilitation and is not one of accountability. And so you see at sort of the highest level of institutions, the family's control. But when you sort of drill down and you talk about the culture, the regulatory culture within these free zones, then it is one towards sort of facilitation. And to just draw the attention back to, I think, one of our one of the colleagues, I think Marcena Hunter, who wrote along with Sean Bloor, wrote a paper on the gold trade. The gold trade predominantly happens in a commercial free zone, and the DMCC, the Dubai Multi-Commodity Center, is both a regulator, and its job is also to promote and encourage investment into DMCC. Those are goals that are clear opposites of each other. So there is both sort of very hard evidence and anecdotal evidence that you can sort of piece together and make a very strong case for this problem.
Do you think that hawala plays a crucial role in the money laundering schemes, or I mean just?
So I'm being South Asian myself. This is an it's always a possibility that is interesting conversations. Now hawala or any other informal remittance service is both good and bad, because it serves an important and incredible role in helping a lot of economic migrants send money back home, and you cannot divorce that role that hawala has as sort of a legitimate sort of financial remitter. Without question, it also has a clear role in sort of being able to sort of illicitly launder money. And I think a good example was sort of the Wall Street exchange that was 100% owned by the UAE government, that was tied to sort of the Taliban, Hezbollah. Yeah. But I also sort of do want to take the time to sort of cite back to something that came out of the US government did right after 9/11, which is to sort of really dig deep into sort of these money value transfer services, which is there is what I think they at that point tried to distinguish it as white hawala and black hawala, which is there was legitimate and illegitimate, and that gets very problematic because it's sometimes impossible to separate these threads. There is a bigger question of how you should formalize and what should formalization look like. But I think what underpins both the legitimate and illegitimate, the illegitimate side is, underpinned by the fact that it provides great anonymity. The legitimate side is underpinned by the fact that it provides cost structures at an affordable rate that more formalized institutions don't. Until you can solve that, you will never see a migration of hawala into a more formal system. So those are just important things to consider as we sort of find a way to not take a myopic view of this, but a broader view of what sort of hawala means, both for criminal enterprise, but also millions of legitimate economic sort of migrants just trying to send a paycheck back home.
Thank
you. So you're welcome.
Matthew, unfortunately, this business model works very well for Dubai because it's a true business model, isn't it? So what can we do? What kind of suggestion you can give to change, to begin changing the situation?
Well, you alluded to the sort of complexity of this issue, which Jodi mentioned earlier, and why we decided to take on, writing such a sort of multifaceted report, talking about all these different angles to illicit financial flows through Dubai. And so as the sort of that explanation, that complex explanation of the problem suggests, the solutions are equally complex and fraught with pitfalls. Not least of which is the obvious competing foreign policy priorities, which none of us have really touched on because we've been talking about the anti-corruption or the corruption facet, the nature of the problem affecting Dubai, which is, the broader Western approach to Gulf allies, right? Like countries like UAE or others in the region that are seen as these islands of stability and these very reliable partners, right? We've seen with the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, right, and the military operations in Yemen, how, again, Western democracies can really be caught between the desire to support traditional allies like Saudi Arabia, maintain good connections with them, and by extension the UAE, and standing true to some of these very important sort of universal goods that they value really closely. And so things like human rights, anti-corruption tends to be put in that same basket by senior policymakers in the US and the UK, which is, yes, these are important, but these other sort of realpolitik concerns often trump, not to use the not to coin a pun there, but often sort of supersede these soft power concerns. So that makes crafting foreign policy recommendations, or in this case, our recommendations are really to a broader set of actors. So that includes, anti-corruption practitioners like all of us here, and many of those listening to the interview today, as well as government policymakers, international organizations, and non-governmental entities, businesses, banks, and so forth that are actually, doing business in the UAE or doing business in Dubai, and therefore are thinking about these issues very, very carefully, and potentially have reputational and business liabilities that stem from many of these issues, whether it be the sort of trade-based money laundering that Lakshmi talks about in her chapter, or the gold smuggling that we talk about in the paper as well. So we put forward 5 fairly, I think, staid, sensible, almost conservative recommendations as part of the paper, that are targeted at reining in sort of the worst aspects of these international financial flows through Dubai, while also recognizing that, as you mentioned at the very outset, the attractiveness, Dubai's attractiveness to these illicit financial flows stems from its, it's very much a part of its business model, right? In terms of being a free port, inviting this capital, inviting this investment, inviting business people to a place which, as Jodi says, has no fresh water, no natural port. Its business model is its international appeal, and without that business model, there is very little sort of objectively to recommend Dubai as a place to live and do business. That whole world has sort of it's an economic oasis, truly, in the desert, and that
Do
makes.
you think, sorry if I interrupt you. Do you think that we need also more collaboration between justice and law enforcement, international law enforcement? I mean, crime is always global. Crime is always international. So I can start my dirty business here in South America, then move the money to Dubai, and then move again to Europe. So there are many actors involved. So do you think that also from our perspective, we need more cooperation, because the enemy that we face is huge?
Well, that's true. And so, we all know that every anti-corruption problem has a sort of multitude of solutions, policy, law enforcement, changes and reforms to existing laws and so forth. Ironically, the improved law enforcement option, is in a way very much in the Emirati self-interest, right? In the sense that if existing laws were enforced more effectively, if some of these worst sort of abusers that we talk about in our reports, the sort of Doshantosh of the, moving her money to UAE at the last minute, many of these sort of Afghan warlords and so forth, if those individuals, right, were screened out by what is, as we know, a very strict and effective, when it wants to be, sort of Emirati police state security apparatus, it would, in a sense, postpone or preclude the need to undertaking deeper reforms. Now, what we have actually seen, right, is the Emirati government being very resistant of both, and chosen instead to really focus on improving the narrative, right, surrounding, so burnishing its image in the international fora, making sort of token gestures toward, whether it be in terms of law enforcement or other reforms that make it seem like it's a responsible member of the international community, while really sort of trying to bury negative reporting about some of the ways in which international financial illicit financial flows and bad actors, right, take advantage of Dubai to do that. So that brings me to sort of, I think, the first recommendation, which, as you mentioned at the start, is the one that sort of appealed most to you personally, which was, what are some maybe external ways? Okay, so we know, because of their business model, because of their past pattern of behavior, that we can't sit around and wait for the Emirati government or the Dubai authorities, the rulers of Dubai. And I speak of them separately, and you can read about this in the report, because these really, in terms of decision-making entities, are two very different groups of people with different motivations, and they interact, they have their own complex set of interactions. So this notion that Emirati policy or policies involving Dubai is sort of something that happens from the top down, and it's sort of this very direct relationship is a great oversimplification. But our first recommendation really says that Western governments should do more to target UAE-based corruption facilitators with travel and financial sanctions. And although you could read that recommendation and say, oh, slap sanctions on the UAE, well, that's not what the recommendation says. It says, really look at those individuals who are, again, from all across the world, Brazil, former Soviet Union, the United States, UK, I mean, you name it, right? Dubai truly, I mean, you would be astonished. There is no part of the world where that is not, where illicit actors are not looking to Dubai, again, as a place to put money and to do business and to live and to travel to. So really what we're talking about is authorities, wherever they may be. And again, this is not just Western countries, because as we know, Western countries, even when they have these authorities in place, like the UK, they have often limited capacity or limited success sometimes in utilizing them. Or in the case of the US and UK, for example, they have their own domestic policy inconsistencies that make it very difficult for them to go after some of these foreign jurisdictions in a very aggressive way. But really what this is looking at people like the gold smugglers, right, who are fueling conflict in East and Central Africa, or looking at individuals, who are involved in, corruption involving the Afghan government, things that are really directly linked to strategic national security interests in places like the United States, the UK, Europe, etc., and say, hey, these look through the lens of Dubai. Look at some of these individuals, and sort of Dubai sort of being the common denominator by which these individuals are connected, and apply these travel and financial sanctions. Which again, travel and financial sanctions are, the sort of international equivalent of the slap on the wrist. I mean, this is a starting place, right? This isn't, going and detaining people, arresting and extraditing people. This is sort of the step before that. And I think that taking that step would really, be a firm message on the part of the United States, UK, etc., that they're taking Dubai's role in the international community seriously, without taking a punitive approach to the UAE or Dubai itself.
So are you positive about the future? Are you positive?
I think that, what we've seen in, I think we all, as anti-corruption scholars and practitioners, have seen positive movement over the last several years. And I think we're all impatient for more sustained progress that sort of builds, on itself and really has a tangible impact. But I think, if we're looking at this in terms of decades, right, the 2010s will really be seen as a period when a lot of these issues really came to the fore in terms of the global foreign policy conversation and domestic policy conversation. I mean, look, for example, the inclusion in the National Defense Authorization Act in the US this past week of a provision that would get rid of anonymous companies. And so really strengthening in a very tangible way U.S. beneficial ownership regulations. The same, of course, has happened in the UK, slowly but tangibly over the last few years. So the 2020s, obviously, way more needs to be done, but at least we're out of the starting gates now. And I think those of us that have been looking at these issues for some time, would have been much more despondent 10 years ago. And I think there's a much greater acceptance that something needs to be done and should be done. The question often is how, or what is the extent of the problem. And that's why we really put this paper together, was to try to shed some light on both of those issues.
So I'm curious to see in a couple of years another paper just mentioning what it really changed in Dubai. Thank you all for your contributions. Really, thank you.